My name is Alex Carter. I am a writer, and I was trying to overcome writer's block when I decided that a change of scenery might help. I chose Redwood, a small town in northern Maine, famous for its mysterious stories and a certain isolation that promised the tranquility necessary for my writing. As I crossed the old bridge leading into Redwood, I felt like I was entering another world. The dense, tall trees seemed to guard ancient secrets, and a light mist gave a mystical air to the landscape. The house I rented was a century-old structure, with wooden architecture showing clear signs of age. Its dusty windows and the creaky porch under my weight told stories of a past I was eager to uncover. The landlord, an elderly man with deep-set eyes and a calm voice, handed me the keys with a warning. Redwood is a quiet place, but the surrounding forest can be treacherous at night. Be careful. His words intrigued and slightly unnerved me, increasing my curiosity about what was to come. In the first days, I dedicated my time to exploring Redwood. The Victorian houses, the quiet streets, and the few residents I encountered offered a glimpse of a close-knit, reserved community. The locals were kind but reticent when it came to the town's history. In every conversation, I sensed a hesitation, as if there was something they preferred to keep secret. One night, driven by the mysterious atmosphere enveloping the town, I found a diary hidden in my attic. The pages, yellowed by time, were filled with accounts of strange events, shadows moving on their own, and voices echoing among the trees. The reading both fascinated and terrified me in equal measure. I decided to investigate these phenomena. I began my explorations at dusk when the sunlight gave way to twilight and the forest shadows seemed to come to life. On one of these nights, while walking near the local cemetery, I clearly heard someone whisper my name. The sound came carried by the wind, a whisper so clear and directed that it made me shiver. I ran back home, scared but determined to find out more. From that night on, strange things started happening more frequently. Footsteps in the hallways, the rustling of leaves when there was no wind, shadows that seemed to move independently on my bedroom walls. One day, I woke up with the feeling of being watched, and when I opened my eyes, I saw the silhouette of a figure at the foot of my bed, disappearing as soon as I tried to focus my gaze. Curiosity and fear mixed within me. The locals looked at me with an expression that mixed compassion and warning, as if they knew the dangers I faced by uncovering Redwood's secrets. Each day brought new discoveries, each shadow and whisper deepening the mystery, drawing me further into the town's dark secrets. Redwood revealed itself to be a place of untold stories and unresolved mysteries, where even the daylight was not enough to dispel the shadows that, I began to realize, watched my every move. And as night fell over the town once more, I knew that the truth was still out there, hidden in the forest shadows, waiting to be discovered. In those initial weeks in Redwood, each discovery increased my fascination and discomfort. The tombstone of the family that mysteriously died in one night became a focal point for my investigation. The curiosity that brought me to Redwood had now turned into a dark obsession, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to uncover something crucial. I returned to the cemetery several times, feeling increasingly drawn to that place. The atmosphere there was palpably different, filled with a silence that seemed to speak. During one of these visits, I decided to stay until nightfall when the veil between the natural and the supernatural seemed thinner. As evening fell, there was a change in the air, a chill deepening with the growing darkness. The sound of my footsteps echoed strangely among the tombstones, as if someone were walking beside me, mimicking my movements with unsettling precision. The whispers were more intense at dusk. They were almost human voices, murmuring phrases I could only catch fragments of. The words were urgent, sometimes pleading, other times threatening. With my recorder always on, I captured these sounds, hoping to make sense of them later, in a more controlled environment. That particular night, one voice stood out, clearer and closer than the others. "Leave, beware. They see you," it said, or at least that's what my ear discerned through the cold wind. After these visits to the cemetery, the feeling of being watched was no longer confined to that location. It followed me home. Footsteps outside my window, shadows that passed quickly in the corner of my eye when I was writing or reading. The house seemed alive, breathing with an energy I did not recognize as its own before. My sleep was interrupted by vivid nightmares, where voices from the cemetery came to me, whispering secrets in a language I didn't understand. Determined to understand better what was happening, I spent days in the local library. The librarian, who initially helped me with a certain distance, seemed to perceive the seriousness of my quest and began bringing more obscure materials, records not available to the general public. Flipping through old diaries and newspaper records, I found mentions of other strange incidents in the town that were never fully explained. Fires that started without an apparent heat source, disappearances of people who entered the forest and were never seen again, and stories of ancient rituals performed under the new moon. One article in particular caught my attention, detailing a specific night many years ago when an inexplicable mist rose and enveloped the entire town, coinciding with the disappearance of a child. The child was found days later, with no memory of what happened, speaking in whispers about eyes in the mist. This story resonated with my experiences in the cemetery, suggesting a repetition of phenomena the town was trying to forget. As I pieced together this macabre puzzle, it became clear that Redwood guarded its secrets fiercely. Something or someone wanted these secrets to remain buried, and I began to feel that my presence and questions were disturbing a delicate balance. However, the need to know the truth was stronger than the growing fear in my heart. I was determined to continue my search, even if it meant facing the shadows that, I was beginning to suspect, were much more real and dangerous than anything I had ever faced. After weeks immersed in the mysteries surrounding Redwood, my attention turned to an ancient legend that spread throughout the town. Rumors indicated the existence of an isolated house in the dense forest surrounding the town, an abandoned structure for decades linked to a dark character named Mr. Wickham. According to local stories, Wickham had made a sinister pact with dark forces to ensure the town's prosperity, exchanging something unimaginable in return. Armed with my camera, a voice recorder, and a powerful flashlight, I prepared for the investigation. It was a gray autumn afternoon, with a sky heavy with clouds promising rain. The air was heavy with a penetrating cold, and the trail to the house was poorly defined, covered with dry leaves and fallen branches. As I advanced, the trees around formed a natural canopy, filtering the daylight and creating an environment of near-constant twilight. Finally, the house came into view. It was a decaying structure, with broken windows and peeling paint, giving it an appearance of total abandonment. The door was ajar, like an invitation or a trap for anyone daring to enter. I pushed the door with a surge of courage, and the sharp creak it produced seemed to cut through the silence almost deafeningly. The interior of the house was covered with a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. The air had a strong smell of mold and decay. Each step I took raised a cloud of dust, and the wooden floor creaked under my weight as if the house itself lamented my presence. The darkness seemed to deepen as I advanced, and the light from my flashlight cast strange and distorted shadows on the walls. In the main room, I found a large circle drawn on the floor, surrounded by arcane symbols and geometric shapes. The circle was filled with worn black ink, and the symbols, though hard to decipher, seemed to form a ritualistic pattern. The feeling that this place had witnessed occult and perhaps terrible practices was palpable. With the recorder running, I captured every sound, hoping for additional evidence. I decided to explore the rest of the house, moving from room to room. The place was in ruins, with broken furniture and faded portraits of people who seemed to have been erased by history itself. In a room at the end of the hallway, I found Mr. Wickham's diary, hidden under a yellowed piece of paper. The pages were filled with writings detailing his journey into the occult. He had made a pact with an unknown entity in exchange for wealth and influence, and the notes became increasingly paranoid and desperate over time. The diary spoke of how Wickham had involved himself in forbidden practices and performed rituals in the hope of gaining power. The writing became erratic, and the final notes mentioned voices that began to speak to him, demanding more sacrifices. The words reflected the author's deteriorated mental state and were terrifying. With night falling, the atmosphere in the house became even more sinister. What initially seemed like an abandoned place now felt alive, with every shadow and whisper fueling my anxiety. As I tried to leave, I realized the door I had entered through was inexplicably locked. The feeling of entrapment grew, and panic set in as I tried to open the door. The voices began to manifest clearly. "Don't leave, stay. You belong to us now," they said, mingling with the sound of the wind howling through the house's cracks. Desperate, I ran to one of the windows and forced it open with great effort, jumping outside and falling among the forest bushes. Panic took over as I ran, my feet slipping on the damp, leaf-covered ground. The voices continued to call me, their distorted words mingling with the sounds of nature around me. Finally, I saw the city lights, like a beacon of hope in the dark. Back in the city, relief mixed with terror. What I had experienced in Wickham's house confirmed many of the fears I had heard about the town. The feeling that Redwood hid something much deeper and darker than I had imagined was undeniable. The house, with its history and whispers, left me with more questions than answers. Redwood didn't just guard secrets. They were alive, waiting for someone foolish enough to awaken them. I knew I needed to continue my investigation, but with heightened caution, aware that the city guarded mysteries too dangerous to be fully uncovered. The weeks after my terrifying experience at Wickham's house were marked by a disturbing feeling of being watched. My dreams were filled with unsettling visions and indecipherable whispers, only increasing my determination to understand the dark secrets of Redwood better. The sense that something deeper and more sinister was at play led me to search for answers more intensely. It was then that I discovered something that seemed promising, an old microfilm archive in the local library. The archive contained old town records that, according to marginal notes, could shed light on the mysterious events that had occurred more than a century ago. I prepared to delve into the archive, hoping that these ancient records could finally reveal something to explain the horrors I had encountered. The local library was an old and imposing building with an air of mystery and solemnity. The air was stuffy, and the lighting was dim, with few lamps giving a yellowish glow that seemed from another time. I went to the corner where the archives were stored and began reviewing the microfilm rolls using a machine designed for this purpose. The process was slow and tiring, but the possibility of discovering something important kept me focused. After hours of examining documents, one story, in particular, caught my attention. It was a report from the local newspaper in 1897, dated to a specific month that seemed crucial. The article spoke of a series of strange and disturbing events that occurred in Redwood during that period, including mysterious disappearances and unexplained deaths. The article mentioned a secret meeting in a specific forest location, which seemed to coincide with the area where Wickham's house was located. I decided to investigate the location mentioned in the report. It was an even more remote area of the forest, a region that had not been much explored and was marked by an ancient clearing, described as a place where ancestral rituals were performed. Equipped with a flashlight and my recording equipment, I prepared for a new expedition, now with a sense of urgency and apprehension. The trail to the clearing was difficult to navigate. The trees intertwined densely, creating a natural labyrinth of shadows and silences. The path was covered with a thick layer of leaves and dry branches, making each step a challenge. As I advanced, the environment seemed increasingly oppressive. The air was dense and cold, and the feeling of being watched returned, more intense than before. Finally, I reached the clearing described in the article. The place was a circle of bare ground, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to form a natural wall. In the center of the clearing was a large stone, covered with carved symbols similar to those found in Wickham's house. The stone seemed to have been used as an altar, and the air around it had a palpable feeling of sacrifice and despair. While examining the stone, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a low, indecipherable whisper that seemed to come from all directions. The sound was like a distant conversation, mixed with the sound of the wind. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the place into total darkness. The feeling of panic gripped me, and I felt surrounded by an invisible and threatening presence. I tried to turn the flashlight back on, but it was dead. The darkness was overwhelming, and the whispers grew louder and more insistent. I was trapped, unable to see anything but the darkness around me, not knowing what was approaching. Desperation set in as I tried to find a way back, but the clearing seemed to have changed, as if the paths I knew were now labyrinths. Finally, when my flashlight started working again, I saw a group of hooded figures in the distance, standing around the stone. They were silent, and their shadows cast sinister silhouettes over the clearing. Fear gripped me, and I began to retreat slowly, trying not to make any sound that might attract their attention. Every step I took seemed amplified in the silence of the night. I left the clearing with a sense of mixed relief and terror, the vision of the hooded figures still etched in my mind. As I returned along the trail, the feeling of being followed did not leave me. The way back to the city was agonizing, with thoughts of the hooded figures and the persistent whispers in my mind. When I finally returned home, the relief of being safe was immediately replaced by the feeling that something was wrong. The evidence I had found in the clearing and the mysterious figures I had seen left me with a sense that the true terror of Redwood was just beginning to reveal itself. What I had discovered was not just an old story but an active part of a much deeper and more terrifying plot. What I had faced in the clearing seemed to be the manifestation of something much older and more powerful than I could imagine. The mystery of Redwood was far from resolved, and the presence I had felt continued to haunt my thoughts. I knew I needed to continue my investigation, but the experience left me with a certainty. Redwood hid secrets that were much darker and more dangerous than anything I had ever anticipated. After the experience in the clearing, my mind was filled with disturbing images and unanswered questions. The hooded figures around the stone, the unsettling whispers, and the overwhelming feeling that something was always lurking left me with constant fear. Every time I tried to rest or focus on other tasks, the memory of these events seemed to overlay everything. It was during one of those restless nights that I decided I needed a break. The town seemed increasingly oppressive, and the air in Redwood was charged with almost palpable fear. I decided to take a short trip out of town, to a deserted road that cut through the rural area around Redwood. The idea was simple: get away from the place where everything seemed to have started and, perhaps, find some clarity. The deserted road seemed a good choice. It was a little-used road, with few cars passing by, surrounded by open fields and sparse trees. It was a dark, moonless night, which only added to the feeling of loneliness and desolation. I turned on the car radio, seeking some company in the form of music or news, but the only thing I could catch was a disturbing static. As I drove, I began to feel uneasy, as if something was wrong. The feeling of being watched was inescapable. I frequently looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, but only the darkness and moving shadows were visible. The fear intensified with each mile traveled, and the radio grew quieter, as if the road was swallowing all the sounds around me. Suddenly, a faint light appeared on the horizon, in the middle of the deserted road. It was a light that shouldn't be there. At first, I thought it might be a stopped vehicle or a rural installation, but as I approached, I realized there was no sign of life or any visible structure other than the light. My heart raced, and the tension grew. When I got closer to the light source, my immediate relief was replaced by deep terror. The light emanated from a small bonfire in the middle of the road. There was no one around, just the dancing flame illuminating the road and the surrounding area. I stopped the car, and the bonfire's light was the only visible thing in the surrounding darkness. I got out of the vehicle, trying to understand what was happening and if there was anyone there. The bonfire seemed old and had an abandoned feel. The flames crackled softly, but the sound of the wood popping was almost deafening in the night's quiet. I approached slowly, and then I saw something that made my stomach turn. On the ground around the bonfire were drawings made with ashes and what seemed to be dried blood, forming strange and disturbing symbols. The symbols were similar to those found in Wickham's house, but much more detailed and with a sinister aura. I knelt to examine the symbols, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I looked back, trying to see if anyone was approaching, but there was no sign of life. The fear was overwhelming, and the idea that I might be in a place where no one should be only increased my anxiety. While examining the symbols, I heard a sound behind me, a faint dragging as if someone was moving silently. I turned sharply, but nothing was visible. The fear turned into panic, and I decided to return quickly to the car. The feeling that something was approaching, something I couldn't see but clearly felt, made me quicken my steps. When I returned to the car, the engine failed to start. The anguish intensified, and the feeling of dread seemed to grow exponentially. I was trapped in a place where nothing made sense, and where I couldn't trust anything around me. Every sound, every shadow, seemed to carry an imminent threat. Finally, the car started, and I drove away from the deserted road with a sense of mixed relief and terror. I drove at high speed, not daring to look back, although the feeling of being followed never left me. The road seemed endless, and every turn and every shadow made me question whether I was truly safe. When I finally returned to the city, the relief of being safe was immediately replaced by persistent unease. The experience on the deserted road and the bonfire with the disturbing symbols only confirmed my suspicions that Redwood was shrouded in a much deeper and darker mystery than I could have imagined. The fear and the feeling of constantly being watched were not just figments of my imagination. They were real, and I had only begun to scratch the surface of what Redwood hid. These experiences led me to conclude that the terror in Redwood was not just a matter of past events, but something still active and involving everyone who ventured to uncover the truth. With each step I took in my investigation, it seemed I was getting closer to the essence of the fear that permeated the town, and the deserted road was just one of many signs that Redwood guarded secrets that could be much more than I was prepared to face. After the disturbing experience on the deserted road, the feeling that something sinister was lurking intensified. The town of Redwood seemed to have a hidden secret, and each discovery only deepened the mystery. With the sense that danger was getting closer, I decided to return to the local library, a place that paradoxically always felt like a refuge and a source of knowledge. It was the only place where I could find more information about the town's dark past, which seemed intertwined with the terror I was facing. The library was an old building, constructed in the early 20th century, with an air of solemnity and quiet. The architecture and interior, with its wooden shelves and soft lights, gave a sense of tranquility that seemed at odds with what I was seeking. However, the peace of the place now seemed a disguise for something more sinister. I began reviewing the documents and files again, looking for any clues that could give me a clearer idea of what was happening. Among the many old papers, I found a set of records of town meetings and events. There were a series of dates and descriptions that seemed random at first, but one detail began to stand out: a series of secret meetings held in the 1920s. These meetings were held at a specific location that coincided with an old name for a gathering spot near the forest, a place I had heard of but never explored. With this new data in hand, I decided I needed to explore this meeting spot mentioned in the records. But before that, I decided to stay a bit longer in the library, thinking there might be something else hidden in the archives that I had not yet discovered. The place was empty, and the library's quiet seemed to increase the feeling that something was about to happen. While examining more documents, the silence was interrupted by a low whisper, almost imperceptible. Initially, I thought it was just the sound of pages turning or something that was disturbing me. However, the whisper persisted and became clearer. It was a constant murmur, a mixture of voices that seemed to come from all sides. The sound was getting louder, almost as if the walls were breathing. My first reaction was to look for a logical explanation. I looked around, trying to find anyone or any source of the sound. But the library was deserted, and the whisper seemed to come from the building itself. I got up and walked through the reading rooms, looking for any sign that someone might be there, but I was completely alone. The whisper was getting louder, and I began to feel a growing sense of dread. I decided to return to the spot where I was working, and as I approached, I noticed something strange. One of the shelves was slightly open, revealing a narrow passage between the books. The whisper seemed to come from there. I hesitated, but the feeling that I needed to discover the source of the sound was stronger than my fear. The passage was narrow and dark, with only a small emergency light illuminating the way. I advanced cautiously, the feeling of claustrophobia intensifying with each step. The whisper was clearer now, and the voices seemed to be speaking directly to me, though I couldn't understand what they were saying. Finally, I reached a small secret room at the end of the passage. The place was covered in dust and seemed unused for years. In the center of the room was a table covered with old documents and strange objects. The papers were covered with symbols and notes, many of which were similar to those I had found earlier, but with additional details. On the table, I found an old book with a worn cover. When I opened the book, I realized it was full of rituals and spells, many of which spoke of pacts with unknown entities and forces beyond human comprehension. The margin notes indicated that these rituals were used to summon and control these entities. As I examined the book, the whisper intensified and turned into sharp, desperate screams. Fear turned into absolute terror when I realized the voices were becoming increasingly clear, as if they were trying to communicate with me directly. The environment became heavy and oppressive, and I felt a strange and threatening presence approaching. I felt a cutting cold, and the light in the room flickered, creating distorted shadows on the walls. The voices became deafening, and the sense that something was about to happen was almost unbearable. I ran out of the secret room and returned to the main area of the library, trying to catch my breath and process what I had found. As I left the library, night had completely fallen, and the relief of being outside was quickly replaced by the feeling that something was following me. The library, which once seemed a safe place, now felt like a site where hidden and dangerous forces were lurking, waiting to manifest. The experience in the library confirmed something I feared. Redwood's mystery was far beyond what I had imagined, and the forces I had begun to understand were much more active and dangerous than I could have foreseen. The feeling that terror was approaching was constant, and what I had found in the library was only part of the enigma that enveloped the town and its dark secrets. The atmosphere in Redwood had changed drastically after my last visit to the library. The sense that something was about to happen became almost unbearable. The discoveries about the ancient rituals and the disturbing whispers in a place I considered safe only amplified the mystery. I decided I needed to confront the center of the mystery once and for all: Wickham's house. The feeling that something evil was directly linked to that house led me to return, despite the paralyzing fear I felt. Returning to Wickham's house was a desperate decision. The house, with its Gothic facade and broken windows, seemed even more sinister as time passed. The darkness around the house seemed almost tangible, as if it were alive and watching my every move. I approached with the feeling that I was about to enter the heart of something evil and ancient. The entrance to the house was even more deteriorated than before. The door, which I had found partially open, was now completely off its hinges, swinging with the wind. The feeling that something was waiting for me was overwhelming, but the drive to discover the truth kept me moving. Equipped with a flashlight and a camera, I entered the house with the courage I had left. The interior of the house was immersed in a disturbing gloom. The dust in the air seemed to move with a life of its own, and the smell of mold and decay was almost unbearable. I turned on the flashlight, and the weak light revealed an interior that was even more desolate than before. The walls were covered in dark stains, and the floor creaked under my feet with every step. I decided to return to the main room, where I had found the strange symbols and the altar. Upon entering, I realized something was different. The altar was now empty, and the symbols I had seen were covered with a layer of dust, as if someone had tried to hide or erase what was there. The air was colder, and the feeling of being watched was even stronger. As I examined the altar, I heard a low sound, like a murmur that seemed to come from somewhere within the house. The feeling of dread grew as I realized the murmurs were not random but formed a sort of pattern. The sound was like a chorus of voices trying to communicate in an indecipherable way. I moved cautiously toward the sound, the feeling that something was about to happen growing with each step. The sound led me to a staircase I hadn't noticed before. The staircase was hidden behind a torn curtain, and the access seemed to lead to the upper floor of the house. With the flashlight in hand and my heart racing, I decided to go up. Each step creaked under my weight, and the feeling that the house was alive and watching me intensified. When I reached the upper floor, I found a slightly open door. The sound of the murmurs was clearer now, and I felt compelled to open the door. As I entered the room, the scene that unfolded was a terrifying mix of horror and mystery. The room was filled with symbols painted on the walls and floor, and in the center was a circle of lit candles with a flame that seemed to have a strange, almost blue color. In the center of the candle circle was a large wooden box. The box was covered with an old cloth, and the feeling that something disturbing was about to be revealed made me hesitate. The murmur of voices seemed to be growing in intensity, as if waiting for me to discover what was inside the box. With tremendous effort, I removed the cloth from the box. What I found inside left me paralyzed. The box was full of old books, papers, and what seemed to be artifacts from ancient rituals. There were also a series of black and white photographs, some of which showed hooded figures in macabre ceremonies. The expressions in the photos were of absolute terror, and I recognized some of the symbols on the walls as identical to those in the photos. The feeling that I was discovering something that should have remained hidden was overwhelming. As I examined the box's contents, I heard a loud and clear sound from the door behind me. The door slammed shut with a bang, and the environment became even colder. The murmur of voices turned into sharp, desperate screams, and the atmosphere was filled with a threatening presence. Trying to remain calm, I began to look for an exit, but the feeling of being trapped in the house intensified. The shadows on the walls seemed to move and contort, creating grotesque shapes that watched me. Every time I tried to open the door, it seemed to resist as if an invisible force was preventing my escape. Fear took over me, and the feeling of claustrophobia became oppressive. I ran back to the main room, trying to find a way out of the house. The environment was chaotic, with the symbols on the walls seeming to distort and come to life. The murmur of voices became deafening, and the presence I had felt was becoming almost tangible. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I managed to leave the house. I ran to the car, fear and adrenaline driving me away. The feeling that something was chasing me did not leave for a moment, and the road that once seemed an escape route now felt like an endless maze. When I returned to the city, the relief of being safe was immediately replaced by the certainty that I had only scratched the surface of the terror that Redwood hid. Wickham's house, with its secrets and ancient rituals, was the epicenter of something much greater and more terrifying than I had imagined. After my last and terrifying visit to Wickham's house, it was clear that I had awakened something much more sinister than I could have ever imagined. The nights in Redwood became even more disturbing. The whispers were incessant, and the feeling of being watched never left me. The visions of hooded figures and macabre rituals haunted my dreams and reality. I decided I couldn't continue living with this constant fear. I needed to confront whatever was haunting the town and somehow end the cycle of terror that enveloped Redwood. With renewed determination and forced courage, I prepared for one last expedition into the forest and Wickham's house. This time, I wouldn't be alone. I invited some townspeople who also had an interest in solving the mysteries or who had lost family members to the inexplicable events haunting the town. We met in the town square at nightfall. Each of us was equipped with flashlights, cameras, and, as a precaution, protective items. It was a small group, but everyone was determined to end the terror surrounding Redwood. We walked silently through the forest, each branch snap and wind blow sounding like a sinister warning. We arrived at Wickham's house, which seemed more threatening than ever under the pale moonlight. The door was open, as if waiting for us. We entered together, the air cold and heavy with the feeling of being watched. We headed straight to the upper floor, where I had found the circle of candles and the wooden box with artifacts. To our surprise, upon reaching the room, the circle of candles was lit again, and a hooded figure stood in the center, murmuring inaudible words. The figure did not seem to notice our presence, or perhaps it simply didn't care. With a nod, I signaled for us to advance together. As we approached, the candles began to glow more intensely, and the hooded figure finally raised its head. The eyes that stared at us from beneath the hood were empty, black as the abyss. A sharp chill ran down my spine. The murmurs of the hooded figure turned into a deafening scream, and the room was filled with an oppressive energy. I remembered Mr. Wickham's diary and the rituals described. I had noted down some passages that seemed to be counterspells, a desperate attempt to interrupt what was happening. With trembling hands, I took the paper from my pocket and began to recite the words. The air around us seemed to vibrate, and the hooded figure writhed in agony. The others in the group began to recite too, and the room seemed to explode with conflicting energy. The shadows on the walls danced frantically, and the figure in the center of the circle began to dissipate into a dark mist. One by one, the symbols on the walls and floor began to disappear as if ink was being sucked back into the paper. Finally, with one last scream of agony, the figure disappeared completely, and the candles went out. The silence that followed was deep and overwhelming. The oppressive feeling vanished, and the air felt lighter, cleaner. We looked at each other, astonished and relieved. We had done something significant, but we knew there was still more to do. We searched the house one last time, making sure no traces of the rituals remained. We took the books and artifacts with us, determined to destroy them safely. The house, now devoid of its sinister energy, seemed just an old, abandoned structure. As we left, the moon shone more brightly, and the forest around us seemed less threatening. The feeling of victory and relief was palpable, but we were aware that peace in Redwood was fragile. The town still bore the scars of past events, and the residents would need time to recover. Back in town, we burned the books and artifacts in a controlled fire, watching as the flames consumed the last remnants of the dark rituals. The rising smoke seemed to carry the weight of Redwood's secrets, dissipating into the night sky. The experience united us, and although the fear was still present in our memories, the certainty that we had faced and defeated something terrible gave us strength. The town of Redwood could finally begin to heal. Life gradually returned to normal, but the events we witnessed would stay with us forever. Redwood's history, with its dark secrets and forbidden rituals, became a lesson about the dangers of tampering with forces beyond human comprehension. And I, Alex Carter, left Redwood with a new understanding of terror and courage, knowing that some mysteries are meant to remain hidden and that some nightmares, once faced, never return to haunt us. If you liked this story, you can't miss the story of Daniel, who, when he meets a mysterious woman who shows him an old photograph, doesn't imagine his life is about to turn into a nightmare. The image of an abandoned Victorian mansion brings with it a dark curse, triggering terrifying events that threaten his family. Desperate for answers, Daniel delves into the macabre history of Everleigh Mansion, facing evil forces and uncovering disturbing secrets. Follow this journey against the unknown and discover how the curse of a simple photo can devastate entire lives. Are you ready to face the fear? To uncover these mysteries, watch the video here in the card or look for the video before this one on the channel. And, of course, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments if you've had a paranormal experience too. Stay brave and see you in the next macabre story.